Okay, I think for the moment, everybody's in the room. So once again, welcome to First Person Voice. I'm Saralinda Lichtblau, Director of Education at the Hudson River Museum. And it is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce today's program and its moderator, James E. Bartlett. Who is the co-curator of Derrick Adams' Buoyant and a founding member of Open Art, a company dedicated to demystifying art for new collectors. From 2012 to 2018, he was executive director of the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Arts, or MOCADA, in Brooklyn, where he curated multiple exhibitions and led a $10 million capital campaign for the development of the museum's new building. We are grateful to him for conceiving, organizing, and moderating this panel, First Person Voice, in which he and our incredibly impressive guests, writer and activist Emil Wilbekin, filmmaker Terence Nance, and designer and filmmaker Walé Oyéjidé, will explore the importance of Black artists creating and controlling their own artistic images in mainstream media. We thank these distinguished guests, generous participants who will be introduced in more detail by James Bartlett, and we thank Art Bridges for their support of today's program. This virtual conversation will examine the growth, visibility, and importance of a new generation of artists creating works that explicitly reflect their own lived experiences and that of their communities. It obviously comes at a watershed moment in this country's fraught history of racial inequity, and will reference artists both contemporary and modern, as well as works currently on view at the Hudson River Museum in Derrick Adams' Buoyant, which we invite you to enjoy in person through next Sunday, August 23rd. And We Came to Party and Plan, which remains on view through October 18th. We thank you for being here for this really important talk. Please, throughout the talk, you are welcome to ask your questions in the chat box, and that will be facilitated by our programs manager, Olivia Cipriano. The speakers would be glad to address your questions toward the end of our program. And now I'd like to bring in our moderator and co-curator of Derrick Adams' Buoyant, James E. Bartlett. James.
Thank you, Linda. I can hear all the applause everywhere. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, Sarah Linda. Thanks, Hudson River Museum. It was great to be able to put this together. So this program is going to be probably a little bit more informal than maybe a typical museum program, because when I was asked to put this together, I really just reached out to my family just to have a conversation. The experience of co-curating Derrick Adams' current exhibition at the Hudson River Museum, Buoyant, and We Came to Party and Plan, a two-part exhibition. Obviously we're exploring lots of different themes, one of which is the importance of an authentic voice and the importance of being able to tell one's own story and one's own narrative from a first-person view, and how new nuances to life experience, the Black experience, get uncovered when we go deeper from our own perspective, as opposed to, looking at life from the outside. And so in Derrick's case, he was interested in exploring joy and the moments of pleasure and relaxation that he didn't see depicted in contemporary art when it comes to Black people. The conversations about struggle and the conversations about oppression, while important and valid, are not the full scope of the human existence. No individual exists constantly in a state of struggle. We all experience joy, we all experience love, we all experience relaxation and time to breathe. And so that's what one of the core elements of the exhibition is. And so in this conversation, I wanted to just open it up to talk about and think about the importance of telling one's own story and why that is so crucial, and why it's so crucial to have the freedom to be able to articulate and the platforms in order to disseminate those voices. And so I'm going to jump straight into it. I'm not going to read long bios, because if you all don't know about these three gentlemen, please Google them. I cannot do them justice in 30 seconds, but I'll just say that we have Emil Wilbekin, who is a writer, editor, content creator. He's the chief creative officer of World of Wilbekin, a multi-platform content company. We have Terence Nance, filmmaker, creator of Random Acts of Flyness on HBO. We also have Walé Oyéjidé, a filmmaker and fashion designer. So I want to jump straight in, start to chat with you guys. And also, as Saralinda noted, if you all have questions, please put them in the chat. Olivia from Hudson River Museum is going to be compiling those, and we'll come to those in a second. So I wanted to start off with I want to toss something to Emil, and I'd love to hear, because I see you. We haven't connected in a few months. You know, pandemic kind of kept us apart a little bit, but you know, I see how active you've been with Native Son and with kind of some of the activist conversations you've been having, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about Native Son in particular, and this particular moment that we see ourselves in.
Sure. Thank you, James, for inviting me to be in this space, and to the other panelists. I'm humbled, because I really look up to your work and to your artistic vision and your activism. So Native Son is a platform and a movement that I created about 4 years ago to inspire and empower Black gay men. And the thing about it was, when I started it, everyone was like, well, why just Black gay men? And I was like, well, why not Black gay men? And I really kind of created an intervention for myself. So how could I create a space of fellowship, a space of empowerment, inspiration, and celebration, that we particularly focus on Black gay professional men? And I did that because there is no space for us. And so it started off as doing live events and conversations, and then has now blossomed into 27,000 on Instagram and a large Facebook and Twitter following. But what is interesting is to create a space where we have a voice, where we have power, where we can tell our narrative and control our narrative. And so in quarantine, it was really interesting because no one on Instagram was speaking to this community. And so we basically took it upon ourselves to create 7 days of programming, from conversations. T. Oliver Reed, who is a Broadway actor and activist, does Black Gay Broadway, where he talks to different Broadway legends and choreographers and directors and writers. I do conversations with different thinkers like Darnell L. Moore, you know, other people like Reggie Van Lee, just people who are in the community that we don't necessarily know their full story. We know parts of their story. But in that, I mean, we started at 13,000, and now we're at 27,000 on Instagram. And so just basically telling our stories and showing our visuals and our art and our story really spoke to the community. So I think it's about having that voice and having that voice heard. I think during the racial equity protests, it became more important for us to really stand up and lean into, how do we support the Black gay community at large? How do we support our Black and brown trans sisters? And how do we really stand up for ourselves and represent ourselves in a way that is authentic to who we are?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm curious, you tell me a little bit more about the responses you've been getting, as you mentioned, you know, kind of hearing and seeing that authentic voice and the response that you've gotten. What have been some things that you've been hearing from individuals and from groups, you know, around, you know, this being a space that wasn't being filled before?
Well, I think for a lot of people, being in isolation and quarantine, it has given them a place to have kind of virtual fellowship and to see other people like themselves. The biggest thing that was surprising to me is how many young Black, gay, and queer men from Africa who have been coming to us, and now starting more from Brazil, because they don't feel connected. in those spaces. And in many places in Africa, it's illegal to be, you know, LGBTQ, and it's against the law. So they can come here and actually see reflections of themselves or possibilities of who they could be as artists, as leaders, as actors, as directors, as wardrobe people, whoever they want to be. And so that's really powerful. I mean, a lot of them feel oppressed where they live. And so this platform has really become a place of kind of Black gay liberation for them.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna jump to Terence real quick. And by the way, so I'm gonna jump to each person for a quick little first person intro, but also I'd love for everybody be thinking about just some questions we want to toss around to each other, so that not just me throwing one way. But Terence, you know, so for those of you all, well, who may not know, Terence and I go back 20 plus years, brothers and collaborators, etc. So I wanna jump back, I mean, not 20, maybe 15 years ago to when we started an oversimplification of her beauty, Terence's first feature film. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that process of conceiving and creating something that quite frankly, you know, didn't exist in the world of cinema. And once it hit the world, you know, receiving the feedback and those, you know, accolades, if you will, of a recognition that this is actually truly a new voice within the space.
Man, age of history. How do I remember? It's interesting because you know, I definitely hadn't reflected on what the moment was like in a long time. But I watched it recently because Tyler Mitchell did this thing, this kind of online festival called Tyler Mitchell's Night at the Cinema. And I watched it for the first time in a long time. And, you know, it was, I guess, like, interesting to see how some of just like the aesthetic of it, you know, felt more familiar now. It felt like, you know, a lot of just the way it was edited and the sound and, you know, the style of it, you know, felt more recognizable to me, as obviously having a lot of distance from it. Like, I didn't remember so much about making it, so I could kind of watch it from more of a viewer's perspective. And I think at the time it came out, one big thing is like, it felt very unfamiliar, you know, like it felt very, like there wasn't a kind of guidebook for watching it. And I think that was people's experience of it at the time. And I think I don't know that, I wouldn't necessarily venture to say that it has influenced a lot, because I don't really know that, but I do think that there's been an energetic shift in like what a film can be and like what constitutes, you know, a feature film, that we're definitely, I think, at the tip of that spear in a way now. And, you know, it wasn't so much that at the time. So, you know, I think it's interesting because I think a lot has you know, transformed in terms of the aesthetic of Black cinema, and it feels like it's a good feeling that there's a home now for it. There's a rubric for understanding what the language of it is cinematically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and would you say you think some of that is coming from kind of the fellowship and conversation that's going on, you know, between Black filmmakers, Black creatives, you know, like that connectivity?
Definitely, you know, like I think AJ always says, or maybe he's citing somebody when he says it, that you know, thinking about like the kind of most productive period of jazz, you know, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, you know, Alice Coltrane, like all, you know, playing with each other and being around each other, talking to each other a lot, and that the music is a result of sociality, you know, just kicking it at the end of the day. And I think that I find that to be true in a lot of ways, but also maybe, you know, something about the dislocation, just like at the end of the day, we live in a more isolated, I mean, even I'm talking even before needing to isolate, you know, like we live in a more isolated time in a way. And I think that has been part and parcel, you know, the communing has been part and parcel to the evolution of an aesthetic. But, you know, we can do more. We can do better, for sure. You know,
working on that.
Yeah.
I know, Wale, I want to jump over you real quick, and so you had a interesting route to your, you know, to discovering your own creative voice. So Wale first got his law degree and I guess passed the bar, right? I always assume that, but
yeah, I did.
Passed
Everyone
the
does,
bar.
but I did.
Yeah, and then promptly decided that wasn't what you wanted to do with your life, and started exploring various creative outlets, including fashion design with the brand Icare Jones, as well as recently, which is a piece I'd love to hear you talk about, diving more deeply into filmmaking in order to tell stories, because at least from my perspective, but please elaborate, that even the clothing line has always been a form of narrative and of storytelling and a way of getting out stories. And so I think this transition from fashion into film is kind of just the evolution of that narrative. And if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the genesis of this probably, as somebody who has a fashion collection ongoing, you're always creating campaigns from a kind of a commercial market point of view. So you're always shooting things and making images. I think fashion is ubiquitous. It is like the air we breathe, like the resources under our feet, something that's everywhere and something that has been, for the most part, poisonous to society. Historically, in the present day, it is hugely exploitative of the people who make the clothing. And it does, for the most part, nothing but harp on the insecurities of people around us. You're not tall enough, you're not thin enough, you're not blonde enough, you're not rich enough, you ain't got the swoosh on your feet, all those things. So for me, as every youngish Black man, it was the idea of I can walk into the Louis Vuitton or whoever, or Gucci, and realize they see me as nothing but a commodity. They see me as somebody who to prop up their bottom line. There was no perception or conception of what it is that I need as an individual, what will sustain me, what will help me flourish. It was just about, here's another person swiping a card. So I think early on, it was very much this idea of like, well, if I'm going to make something, if I'm going to make a thing, if it's a pair of jeans, if it's a song, it's a film, there's always the question of what is the why? Why you're adding one more thing into the pile of billions of things in a world that has too much excess and waste? Why? What are we doing? I happen to be somebody who grew up in Nigeria and I've traveled quite a bit in my upbringing. So I have this very nomadic outlook on the world, which I think has really kind of informed the way that I embrace and draw from so many different cultures. And it occurred to me that we have such a rich history and present contemporary society on the African continent that is not seen or heralded on the same level as the same pantheon as the Mona Lisa, the Statue of David. Why is that the case? Why is it you walk into the British Museum of Art, we're on the bottom floor or we're in the basement, but all around you, you see Caravaggio, Michelangelo, these guys, that's the illest, right? At the same time, though, for me, there's the idea of using, almost in the way that we write pop songs with the same chords, using the most recognizable language for what is spoken to the masses. So using this language of classical, westernized beauty so that it's instantly recognized, it's recognized as like, I get what this is saying, but then you flip that by injecting people like this, people of a darker hue. And what happens with that cognitive dissonance of an audience that's used to seeing alabaster marble faces on a certain plateau, and then you put us in that same kind of setting and inject our narratives and stories, and what does that do to the mind of like, I'm not supposed to love this, but I can't help looking at it because it's what I'm used to looking at and recognizing as beautiful. And I think that kind of impetus has been this surge through all of my design work, storytelling work, whether it be my previous career as a musician to being even an attorney, the idea of advocating for audiences and for people who might be discriminatory towards a certain population. So really the fashion for me, it wasn't the idea in the beginning, but it has always just been a vehicle. It's always just been an excuse to tell stories about people like myself, people like everybody on this chat, people who we know to be regal and beautiful, people who we know to be nuanced, and just people who need an opportunity to speak and to extol their own virtues as much as anybody else. So whether it be beats, whether it be clothing, whether it be now moving frames 24 per second, we're just telling stories.
I appreciate that. And I want to throw a question out to everyone. So this panel was conceived before the immediate moment of movement for social and racial equity here in this country. This immediate point, we were actually going to have this conversation in person a couple months ago at the museum, but obviously through this new lens that everyone, I think, is viewing the world. Things are being uncovered that I think to us were very obvious and were just a sheer matter of life, whether it's related to police brutality or to the difficulties of getting our stories out. So obviously this conversation being about the importance of owning, telling, creating our own stories. I'm curious to hear from your perspectives, where have been your biggest challenges in creating and finding platforms for your narratives? And I know that in many ways, knowing each of your stories, in many ways, you've created your own platforms. And so I know that has come from, not having the natural outlets to get things out there. But I would love to hear from you all, the challenges, and in this particular moment, where do things need to change?
Sure, I'll jump in. I've been really that most of my career has been in Black media spaces. So I kind of have been blessed to, my career really started at Vibe magazine, and I was the editor-in-chief in the golden era of hip hop. So that was a really great time to be able to push Black narratives in a way that aligned with the disruption of hip hop. And even there, kind of pushing the community, right, to think past just whatever they were displaying in music videos and on stages, but really to think about the cultural implications. So what are the intersections of LGBTQI+? Where's the intersections of Black cinema, of literature, of fashion, and really bringing that all together. And then the other places, I worked at Giant Magazine, I worked at Essence, but always in those places kind of pushing the boundaries on those Black platforms to make us think more broadly. And I think this time right now, the challenge in the past has been people pushing our stories to the side. They don't really matter. You're going to hit a quota. We want your story, but we want your story in this way. Whereas now I think the opportunities, the lens is wide open, and it is for us to push through. People are pushing back because our stories haven't been told the way that we see them and the way that we know they exist. So for instance, and now I'm getting a lot of calls from people that are like, oh, we want you to do diversity and equity consulting, and we want you, how come you've only worked in Black media? Did you choose to? And I was like, I chose to, but that's who hired me. Like, I wasn't getting the jobs at Condé Nast or Hearst or those places because they didn't see me. And I'm definitely qualified, but you didn't think that I was important. Now they're coming because they're scrambling, because they have to put their money where their mouths are, and they have to actually show that they're not in many ways racist, that they have been inclusionary, which they have not. So it's hard, it's hard to push through and tell your own story, but I think you have to just find that deep inside of you, the way our ancestors have. Native Son, our icon is James Baldwin. And I chose James Baldwin because he was so forward-leaning and so about advocacy and activism and unapologetic. And I think that's how we have to be right now.
So I think another angle of this challenge of finding space for our voices is the fact that so few examples, whether they be films or magazines, or any other vehicle for disseminating these narratives, there's such a limited number of examples that reach a wide audience that each individual project takes on the burden of telling the story and the narrative of all and everyone. And so it always gets, kind of picked at under this microscope from every angle, from the angle of, is this entertaining me enough is this, telling the true and authentic story of every single Black person, et cetera. And we see this from, everything, conversations around Tyler Perry's work to Black is King, most recently, coming out, that one of our brothers, Blitz Bazawule, co-directed. And I'd love to hear from each of you in your perspective, the challenges with that, the limitations with that, and or, is it necessary to look at each project through this broad spectrum of how it represents the culture, I will say?
My feeling is that, especially in terms of the discourse, the concept of the discourse, that particular discourse, is more of an echo chamber than I think we can perceive because we're so within it. I saw something that said that like only 20% of Americans are on Twitter or something like that, and that the demographic skews basically us, millennials who have advanced degrees and things, and that's just what it is, you know what I mean? And so like, I think that all discourse is, it's amoral, so it's going to happen, and where it leads us is fractal. That's going all these places. But I think that specific discourse around like what a Black character or an image of a Black person can do, like in terms of hurting or helping, especially the concept of a Black child watching it. The foundational dynamic, I think, that kind of pressurizes that discourse is the fact that it is true that like what a Black kid sees in a movie can help or hurt the cause, of their development. What a Black kid, a Black person sees can help or hurt the cause. How much of it, any given thing they see, and I think that's a foundational reality. But I think that foundational reality is in everybody who's making things mind, and it's just going to present the way it presents. You know what I mean? I think that the concept of being able to, like, I guess, prescribe a product, a film, a movie, a painting or anything like that will inherently correct or be a corrective action to some sort of concept of like deficiency or scarcity in terms of representation of Black people in a certain way is an echo chamber. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost unknowable in a way. Like, we can't really know. I think we can only just know that, yeah, it has an effect. Whatever we're doing has an effect. So just, just like you get in a car, you have a license because theoretically, if you don't drive correctly, you're gonna hit somebody. You might injure them or injure yourself. So I think it's like finding a way to make sure that we all kind of like driving responsibly in a way as artists. But at the end of the day, the discourse itself, I think, is an echo chamber, and I think we engage with it as if it's like inherently it's like an empirical observation of what the world knows or thinks, as opposed to like what it really is, which is just us on the Zoom call, on larger concentric circles of Zoom calls, essentially,
right.
Or whatever it is. But yeah.
I'd be curious to know from all you guys what degree of, kind of following up with Terrence's point, actual responsibility you think you have, knowing that we are all so affected by the images we took in growing up. For sure. Like, I look at everything I've made, it is obviously a direct reaction to growing up, to moving to the US in the 80s and it not being cool to be African. And so you spend your whole life building this shell of like, oh, they think we're whatever. And so if I can make art, I'm going to make art that directly speaks to that point. But how much of that is just this baggage you're carrying, and how much responsibility you feel to almost like the 16-year-old version of yourself that wasn't accepted to continue to speak to that kid or the current version of him or her, versus just like making whatever? Do you feel like you always need to be directing something prescriptive, something to be a balm to what society is placing on this kid's shoulders, or
Well,
not?
I think that's interesting because like framing it as like responsibility, I think is a little bit of a, I've found for me, it may not be relevant because whether you feel responsibility to talking to a younger version of yourself, talking to your like the literal child within you that, you know, internalized America's sort of derogatory concept of Africans, whether or not you want to be doing it or feel responsibility doing it, you are doing it. Like no artist is not doing that. Like there's this really, this documentary on the making of Roma and Alfonso Cuarón. He's talking about how he was feeling all seized. He was like real mad one day on set. He couldn't figure out why. He had to take a walk. And then, you know, if you've seen the movies about his life as a kid or whatever, and then he directed the scene and he realized later that he was mad because the scene he was directing was a recreation of the moment his father left his family. And so it's like, he obviously sat there and wrote a whole movie about his life as a child, but even in the moment of doing it, he couldn't identify that, you know, he was in conversation with child him directly and emotionally, you know. And I think that on some level, it's just about knowing that the reality of like human development or whatever, or really, I think the more like how spirits and bodies work, you know what I mean? That it's just the child you is already going to be there. Not even child you know, many children and ancestors are already there. And so like whatever you're doing is always in service and in conversation and points of tension with, you know, that child you. And so like I think it's more that we all have to sort of interrogate if that practice is actually doing that relationship with child us as opposed to like inflaming it or hurting it. You know what I mean? It makes you think of the movie It. Like that movie is about childhood trauma coming up in the form of a crazy clown, you know? And I, you know, when you read the book, that's very much about that. It's very directly about that. And I could tell in the movie there was a lot of, it's about childhood trauma, you know, but is the thing that came out in conversation with the child in a way that helped heal that trauma that happened? You know, I think that's more the question. And it's a very individual question for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, you know, I think of art and culture as a quilt, as a collage, and kind of all our different stories create this big collage. And I think the issue is that, you know, we go back to the idea of not being monolithic. So each part of everyone's story kind of paints this bigger picture of Blackness to me. And I think about, you know, when I first saw Moonlight, and I thought, you know, my God, like that's so much trauma for a young queer boy to go through growing up in South Florida. And I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. My dad's from St. Croix, and my mother's from Des Moines, Iowa. So I grew up in this very kind of melange of Black culture. And so when I saw Moonlight, I thought, you know, wow. But then it definitely triggered things that had happened to me as a child of you know, abuse that I had buried. But through the art of that film, which was not my experience, I was able to have some type of healing. So I think us just telling our stories in a way is a form of being responsible and just showing the vastness and depth of who we are as Black people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, and on this same wavelength. I'm curious to hear each of your kind of like personal coping mechanisms, responses to navigating this world of content creation. You know, when you simultaneously feel an intense need to tell a story. I won't say necessarily your story, but to tell a story, and know that that story is going to, you know, the weight of many individuals' past experiences are going to, you know, be placed upon that story if it ever does reach the world, and that you're going to have to navigate a gauntlet in order to present that to the world. So I'm curious on a personal level how you deal with, how you cope with, how you perform the act of creation, if that makes sense. I got real psychologically deep there if y'all didn't notice, but.
I think, so here's for those who aren't aware, this is like, my work appeared in the film Black Panther, and it was really fascinating because essentially, basically, there's a post-credit scene where the main character, T'Challa, is wearing a scarf that I designed. And point of the story is not that. The point of the story is, I have a daughter who, anybody who knows me or sees my work, she's around a lot. And she's the same age. I started my brand basically when she was born. So I measure this iteration of me on the same trajectory exactly as my daughter. So she's seen the same scarf that appeared in the film laying around the house, just like playing with it like a thing. And then a couple months later, it's as big as the world. It's on TV, it's on Super Bowl ads. And then after that, she's at home watching the DVD, like there's daddy's thing. And in her mind, that's her normal, regular experience. And so for me, it's the surreal experience of like, yo, what is this person learning? She's the idea you can conceive of a thing, you can make a thing, it can zoom across the world and appear back to you on a screen. Like for her, that is now what is feasible. And it's like just removing me from the equation. It's just watching her truly believe that like there's no reason anything she makes can't be projected universally and have this impact of empowerment. And so it's just really funny to watch her make things with cardboard boxes and just like, oh, we can make a thing. And so when I think of the responsibility or the idea of like our stories being mapped out into many versions of us, everybody else's, it's more about, I think any of us who makes something or creates a thing or a platform realizes that like you can't, much as we want to hold ownership over our things, you can't. The minute you make something and it goes somewhere, a kid in Ohio or middle America discovers your thing, and it puts on a meaning for him in a way that you never conceived, in a way that perhaps means less to you, but is hugely powerful to him, and which is ultimately what matters to him. And so I think it's really just more about making the purest version of your thing that speaks to you and speaks for your child at home, literally or metaphorically, and letting each person who grabs a piece of that story, let it be meaningful to them. And I think you can only get there by being as honest as you can to yourself so that they map onto that authenticity in their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And for everyone, so we have about 15 minutes left in this discussion. So if anyone has any questions, please throw them in the chat. I'm gonna ask another question, and then we'll go to some of the questions that you all may have. I'm curious, you know, just kind of like, because we're in this moment of I won't say rethinking everything, because I've had enough conversations with each of you to know that I don't think this is a moment of rethinking for us, but I think it's a moment in which the world as a whole is paying a bit more attention to the ways we have been trying to rethink the world. And given this moment that we're in, what would be, if you could change one thing about the ways that our stories are disseminated and whether it's the platforms or the access or you know, even the mentality of our, you know, young creators, etc. If there was one thing that you could kind of snap your fingers and change in that regard, what would it be?
I think it's challenging to see, for me, like the toxicity of Instagram. I think Instagram is such an amazing platform that we can show images and videos and whatever we want, right? We can do live, we can have conversations. But I'm distraught with the toxicity of a lot of the political rhetoric, and then the kind of just taking down of people and kind of discounting their existence. It's like a lot of kind of hate speech in a way. And then I see all these beautiful images that people are creating and how they present themselves, but then I also see a lot of images that are kind of people acting out. And so it becomes this thing where it's like, I enjoy it, but then it's also like, it's heavy and it's dark. And I think that part of that is good for art to push things forward, but I also think part of it is can weigh on your spirit. So if there was some way that we could find balance within social media, that would be my magic snap.
Mm-hmm. Any other magic wands?
I guess, there is no magic wand, like in a sense, the sort of gift of all you learn from like, things taking so long to change and so many people, I think would be, be lost if there was kind of an instantaneous change. But yeah, I think that there's something around like digital life, just picking up what Emil said around the whatever is lost in the kind of like second and a half dimension, what I call the 2.5 dimension, which is like, it's not 3D, but it's not 2D. It's like we're in the phone space, in that space, which is like extremely transformative in so many ways. But it's also like whatever is alive in there is also like designed to manipulate us, in very, very clear ways. And it's designed to manipulate our concept of affection, I think. So yeah, I think that one thing that could change is some sort of bringing into balance, to pick up what Emil said, some sort of bringing into balance the usefulness and the use and the utility of digital spaces. All of us are not there also, but it does feel like we all are there, and I think that is just a basic thing that I'm even learning, that it is still exclusive in a way that it's difficult to totally be aware of, I think this whole thing that's happening with the post office and voting is kind of like, not in a direct way, but in some way illuminating that like how dependent we all are now and could understood to be on the mail, like the physical mail. And it's like, oh, that's like a thing that, I mean, it's still exclusive, but it's still like maybe more inclusive than just, having a broadband connection in a way.
Yeah. I realized how much of a bubble I'm in 2016 when the president was elected, and I had no clue that, and I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I had no clue that he had a real legitimate chance of becoming the president. So now I've thrown all that out the window, all speculation, I just accept the fact that, Terence, what you stated is the truth, that, kind of just about everyone today exists in some form of a echo chamber. You know what I mean? And that echo chamber has been, put into hyperdrive when we're all in quarantine and we're only interacting digitally. We self-select, who to interact with and how, and then the algorithms select for us, kind of further enhancing that echo chamber. Cool. Any last thoughts or comments before I move it to the questions? Olivia from the Hudson River Museum is going to come on and ask some of the questions that have been put into the chat. But yeah, wanted to just, if there's any last thoughts or any upcoming projects that you all wanted to talk about, feel free. Good. All right, Olivia.
Hey everyone. So one question I got that Emil touched on a bit earlier, but when it comes to performative, the inclusion that you were kind of talking about between hiring or everything, how do you kind of tread the line between honest storytelling versus Black exploitation in your own work? I guess this question applies to everyone, right? I don't know who wants to start, but
I'm thinking, because it's a cogent question. I think all editing is storytelling. So there's never, it's almost like, what is an honest story? Because every story that's told comes from the mouthpiece of someone who's giving an angle on a story. I do think we are in an era of it being very, very, very convenient to portray allyship of some sort. And there's certain, like, I'm sadly a cynic by nature, and it's just like, you have your black box, you have a company hiring singular person X to fill singular slot, and then tomorrow it's back to the same business of churning the same engine. So I think we just have to always be aware that that's going to be just the nature of things, but perhaps in the aggregate effect, maybe it's not so bad. Even the act of performing justice is still a step towards justice in a world in which justice used to be an afterthought. So maybe we're still getting there.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on this?
I'll throw in a quick thought as well. To Wale's point of, kind of this rush to allyship and this rush to, provide platforms for diverse voices, et cetera. I think that, and several entities were called on it quite quickly, although I think it continues. I think the point from which that desire to be an ally comes is very important. I'm thinking of several specific examples, but why is the company or the entity reaching out for this voice at this moment? Is it coming as a part of their overall structure, and is this something that is in what they want to be a part of their DNA moving forward, or is this a special project to show, that they are allies? There was recently a major auction house did an exhibition of Black artists, and the CEO of the auction house tweeted out or posted on LinkedIn or something, kind of patting themselves on the back for a great CSR project, which for those of y'all may know is corporate social responsibility. And I don't think even realized the inappropriateness of that. The fact that selling Black art for a profit to them is seen as corporate social responsibility is extremely problematic. And so that's what I mean by, where does it come from? Is it coming for, this is our corporate social responsibility, or is this, actually how we want to operate as a company or as an entity?
Thank you, guys. So Mary Dillard had a question for Wale. Do you think that African artists have made it cool to be African today? It seems like Black creatives have attempted to have a more global view in relation to looking at experiences of Black peoples in a range of places.
Sounds like the Beyonce Black Panther effect. So I think it's the kind of thing where I'm of mixed minds about it, because for me, there's always the fear of this being a moment. Nobody wants to be the kid at prom who was never asked to dance and it gets asked to dance, and you realize 2 songs later, oh, it was just a joke with the jocks or whatever. Like, are we here because we're a part of this fabric? Or are we here because it's convenient for us to be part of this fabric? So, I think of large entities like a Beyonce, like a Marvel, Disney, Black Panther. These are institutions so big that it's difficult to place almost any kind of like moral ethics on them, in my view. So I think it's up to those of us who have, whether it be Black issues, gender issues, whatever, to be who we are. And society may come to you for the dance today. They may not come to you tomorrow, but you should still be there to dance, so to speak, to use several metaphors at once. It almost doesn't matter if society is here because we are.
Thank you so much. We have a question for Terence from Ryan. How should Black filmmakers and artists of other mediums approach rejecting the anti-Black hierarchies built into the traditional design of the filmmaking process?
The traditional, I think it kind of depends on what the person asking the question means by the traditional design of the filmmaking process. I take that to mean the way that, all these systems of oppression, but, to their point, white supremacy and patriarchy and are in service of a kind of capitalist concept, a hyper-capitalist concepts, which I've been saying that I don't think capitalism, especially in film, exists. I think it's socialism for white guys, because I think there's a sort of process subsidy, the process of subsidizing, a certain type of white guy's creativity. And so I think if that's what it is, like, how do you deal with the fact that we're, I am tasked with making work in a system that subsidizes stuff that they think is cool, stuff that they feel like is amazing, stuff that they feel like is universal, stuff they feel like is going to sustain their bottom line, etc. I think the only answer is divestment. That becomes the only answer. It's sort of like, if you go over to somebody's house and they got a whole bunch of food that you don't like, you ain't gonna eat. You gotta go cook somewhere else. And I think that contending with what divestment actually means, especially knowing that what you are divesting from has its codes that speak for yourself, have been colonized by, whether that's like storytelling aesthetics or ways of making things. And so I think the first moment of divestment has to be like identifying all those hierarchies, those processes that I've been colonized by, so that I don't, whenever I go with my community of people to make another thing, it isn't, colonized. It has its own jumping off point, energetically, aesthetically, in all the ways. And so I think that it's not, that becomes what the inquiry is, the project is like, and I think that's probably the hardest part, is like just sort of starting a new thing, a new dynamic, a new place, a new space, a new site, and figuring out how that site is truly new, truly not, Chairman Fred said, you can't replace white capitalism with Black capitalism. You know what I mean? Which I think means, especially for Black men, we can't replace white capitalism with a kind of Black misogynist patriarchal concept of subsidizing Black men only to make things. That's just one way that our colonization could be ported over to whatever new thing we're created. So I think that's the charge, when imagining us, whatever we're gonna do, what we are doing,
Thank you, Terence. I actually have a question for Emil, and that might be the last question we'll be able to get to today. but Mary Dillard was wondering, can an editor as a creative person be true to him or herself or themselves in context of a magazine that has to get readers and subscribers?
I think absolutely. I think now publishing in its kind of limited form, right? Because magazine publishing is a very slow, kind of dying art form. But even in the digital space, you've seen people like Elaine Walteroff and Lindsay Peoples-Wagner, who are doing kind of leading activism and giving voices to young women and political voices and activist voices in a way that is bigger than what, you know, the Vogue monolith is. So I definitely think that there's opportunity. I think in this day and age, people are looking for those types of editors and content curators who have a strong voice and will bring a broader perspective than what the limited scope of the traditional kind of magazine form that existed.
Thank you, Emil. James, I'm going to give you the floor again, and you guys can go through any last thoughts that you would like to, and comments that you would like to make regarding this program.
Sure. Thanks. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. I appreciate this. For everybody who's in the New York area, if you haven't checked out Buoyant yet at Hudson River Museum, do so. You got about a week to go check it out. We came to Party and Plan. It's actually been extended. You have a couple months. But yeah, thanks everybody for hanging out, and see y'all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.